Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Vibeke Ottesen. And today we're going to talk about what evolutionary psychology, or even psychology more generally, also criminology, can tell us about political violence and the psychology of people who commit political violence, acts of terrorism, and so on. So, Dr. Ottesen, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for having me, and I believe it's the fourth time I'm here, so thank you so much.
No, that's true. That's true. I always love to everyone. We always have great conversations. So let me start by asking you, so how do you approach political violence from an evolutionary perspective? I mean, what is political violence from that psychological perspective?
Well, political violence can very easily be defined, bluntly be defined as violence that's perpetrated with reference to, with conviction of some political ideology, but one should also include religious ideology. But when you look at what sort of phenomena and behaviors are included in that, again, it can get a bit more difficult to define. So you can have mass shootings and attempted mass shootings, and you can have political assassinations and attempted political assassinations, which are easy to define. But as it turns out, despite decades of studying it theoretically, empirically, and attempting to define it and operationalize it, one still hasn't got a definition of terrorism that everyone agrees on and that you can easily operationalize and use in research. But terrorism can be defined as violence, or the threat of violence perpetrated with reference to political or religious ideology. But that isn't the only definition, and it isn't a definition everyone agrees on. Some would say that it also has to include creating fear in the general public or in specific targeted groups of the public. But there are actually no definitions of terrorism in the same way as one can define political assassination and other mass shootings.
Yeah. And is there anything from the evolutionary psychology of violence, and we've already talked a lot about that in our previous conversations, that might apply specifically to terrorism?
Yes, and mass shootings and political assassinations. So political violence can absolutely be studied from an evolutionary approach, and one has done that over the past couple of decades. And as we've talked about before, and you've spoken to a range of brilliant guests, and your audience is very aware of, evolutionary psychology belongs to something that we call the paradigm of selection thinking. Yeah. That means that we start off with the general theory, modern theory of evolution. How does evolution happen? Through the processes of natural selection and sexual selection. That's the meta theory. And then you have a mid-level of the selection paradigm, which is evolutionary biology. And in this area, political violence, you would use the usual suspects on this mid-level, which I'm sure your audience are very familiar with. It's the works of Robert Trivers on the origin and function of sex differences. But also one can use Hamilton's work on inclusive fitness altruism, which he applied to also then studying spite. But if we start with Robert Trivers, he believed that Charles Darwin's ideas of sexual selection on males and females competing within their genders, within their sex, for mating opportunities, he believed that was absolutely correct, but he felt it was lacking somewhat. So in his theory of parental investment, he argued we should look at sexual selection through the lens of parental investment. So he wrote a paper on parental investment that I recommend your audience read, because that's the starting point for a lot of evolutionary psychology work, including that on political violence, coalitional aggression, war, but also terrorism and mass shooting, whether that is coalitional or you have the lone actor. And there are 3 hypotheses that one can use, and I suggest we start with the first one that came in 1985 in a paper by 2 authors that you and your audience are very familiar with, Margot Wilson and Martin Daly.
Yes.
Now, I've talked about them a lot on your show with regards to homicide, and they had a paper already back in 1985, which for evolutionary psychologists is seminal, but not so well known outside evolutionary psychology, and that is a hypothesis they presented in this 1985 paper called the young male syndrome, also in the paper listed as the dangerous young male syndrome. Have you heard of that one?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I had Dr. Daly on the show back in early 2019, and we talked a little bit about the evolution of violence, and I think we touched on that. Yes.
Yeah, it's a hypothesis that he proposed together with his late wife Margot Wilson, and it's a hypothesis that he's still using currently in his homicide research to explain why most homicides are perpetrated with a young male as the perpetrator and a young male as the victim. And in the framework of sexual selection, and Robert Trivers and other evolutionary biologists like Richard Alexander, it was suggesting that because males are in a constant competition for access to females, like literally access to females, but also those things that females look for in males, such as the ability to obtain and control territory, have resources, protect. These abilities create this constant competition among males that females find attractive. Through female choice, the ambition and drive and abilities to obtain territory, resources, status, things that can translate into reproductive opportunities is selected for among males more so than females. Because although females, yes, they can also gain from competition, from status, from accessing and controlling resources, on the other end of the scale, there's a cost to females. The fact that they go pregnant, that they can, a woman gets fertilized, she has to go 9 months pregnant, and then she has to nurse her child, whereas males, they can take a shower and...
We're lucky.
Or not, because as it turns out, you have a male mortality rate, particularly among young males, because of this competition that you have. So you're not that lucky. You're actually rather an unfortunate sex. And when you look at the prehistoric records and what was it that young males died of, it was this competition. It can turn very lethal. Now, in the 1985 paper, Wilson and Daly, they were focusing mainly on criminal behavior and also homicide, but they do touch upon political violence and political status, noting that this can be translated into either fending off competition of the males, but also accessing females, that it gives status and females find it attractive. And although they were mostly concerned with the individual male, that the individual male has got this psychology from his successful forefathers, they were also concerned with something that one in social psychology terms social facilitation. Is that a concept you're familiar with?
Yes, but maybe for the audience, please explain it.
So that is the mere presence of others may very well change your behavior. Just riding a bike, you might be riding a bike at a certain speed when you're alone. If you just have other people present, you will cycle faster. And this was research they did in the 1900s. And they also then did some research seeing if this social facilitation, does that occur in other species? And to the great amusement of my students in social psychology, they actually did this experiment with cockroaches, where even cockroaches will walk at a certain pace. But if you put other cockroaches there, it increases their performance. So you can increase performance, but you can also have more extreme behaviors in general. And so in the paper on the young male syndrome, which is the name of their hypothesis, also that they term in the paper itself the dangerous young male syndrome, they talk about what happens with young men in the presence of other young men. So you can use this hypothesis both to study the lone actor terrorist, the lone actor who does a political association, the lone actor who does mass shooting, but you can also look at those who do it in coalitions. But the point is, if you use it to study this, you're understanding the male psychology as more prone, not every single male in the population, but males as a group are selected to be more prone towards risk, aggressive behavior, aggressive, lethal, violent competition than what females are. So you can use this, you can apply this hypothesis to approach males' overrepresentation across the board on political violence, regardless of definition, regardless of culture. You always have a male overrepresentation.
It even goes beyond political violence, right? I mean, any kind of violence and any kind of crime, or I guess at least most crimes, males are overwhelmingly represented there. Right?
Yeah. So this was then again a hypothesis they had, the young male syndrome, the dangerous young male syndrome, that was first and foremost used to apply the overrepresentation of males in criminal behavior such as homicide. But it is one that lends itself easily to political violence. And then in 2012, there was a group of 3 researchers headed by Melissa MacDonald, who published their paper in 2012, who also had a hypothesis, also based in what is the male reproductive role, physiologically speaking, what is the male reproductive role. And they then had a hypothesis which has become much more known outside evolutionary psychology, which I'm quite certain your audience has heard of, and that is the warrior syndrome.
The male warrior syndrome.
Yeah. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. But
many people have heard of it. They haven't necessarily read Melissa and her colleagues' paper, but everyone's heard of it. It's one that has it also gets used outside of research performed by evolutionary psychologists. And they take it one step further and point to the fact that males operate in coalitions very often. Their aggression is performed in coalitions. And they point to that tribal warfare has been significant in shaping the male psychology as it is today. In prehistoric times, what killed young males most often was the competition, young male on young male violence, but even more so tribal warfare. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, I'm sure you and your audience are familiar with Steven Pinker's work. You've also interviewed Steven Pinker, I believe, on how, believe it or not, and I'm sure many people are not believing it currently, but we are actually, historically speaking, living in the most peaceful times, because not only historically, but prehistoric violence, and men males and females have been selected in that regard, but in very different ways. So males have been selected, Melissa and her colleagues proposed, have been selected to operate in coalitions more so than females have, with regards to aggressing against other males. And so you will have warfare, yes, but you will also have things like, just more mundanely, the whole social psychology phenomenon of in and out groups. So males will more often identify more strongly with some group identity. And with that group identity, they will contrast themselves more and have greater animosity towards an out group than what females have. And you'll have more coherency in that group than what you will have in a female group. Female groups can be considerably more fragmented than male groups. And so when males have this coalitional psychology, that will also explain not only warfare, which males are much more likely to engage in, even currently, but also the whole in-out group. And so you can apply that also to the study of political violence, such as mass shootings, terrorism, and political assassinations.
But let me just ask you then, but there are instances where some of these young males might act alone, or
absolutely, not? Because a group identity with us humans, I mean, it was selected for a very different time than we live in now. I mean, we used to live in groups of, say, 150 individuals, most of them related. And so anyone outside that group was then tribal warfare, a real existential threat. This is not so anymore, but we're carrying the psychology of our forefathers and foremothers. And so the internet can trick us into believing that we are under threat to an extent that we factually are not. And we carry these, the proneness for group identity and hostility towards others to an extent which is quite unnecessary today. But the belief that it is necessary is profound. And an individual can physically have a group identity, physically be in a football team, physically be in a team of supporters in their town, in their part of town. Yes, but also the internet can create group identities. So you can have a lone actor that identifies to something that they would perceive as bigger. And even those, because a tendency we see is with regards to political violence, where you have a lone actor, that lone actor characteristically, quite typically, has mental health issues. And those who have some delusions have delusions of belonging to something big. And we have examples of that in my country, Norway. We have individuals who weren't necessarily sane in the period where they committed this act, and a part of their psychotic delusion was that they were part of something bigger. So even the lone actors may very often have an idea on a psychological level of belonging to something bigger. It just so happens that these things don't exist.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, this might be a very complex question, and I'm not completely sure if it's something that even from a criminology perspective, you have enough knowledge to answer. And if not, it's not a problem at all. But
we'll see.
Do you think that political ideology, and I'm not talking about any specific political ideology, but just political ideology in general, might play a causal role in political violence? I mean, do you think that the specific political beliefs that people have might cause political violence, or that those beliefs or them being part of this or that political orientation is more of a post hoc rationalization that people use to commit political violence?
Well, both Martin Daly and Margot Wilson in their paper, and Melissa MacDonald and her colleagues in their paper, say that the male proneness towards political status is something that has evolved because political status can fend off male competition, or otherwise also translate into reproductive opportunities, as females prefer men who have status, who can access, control, and share, very importantly, share their resources. So this drive towards political activism in males is understood by evolutionary psychologists as something that has a reproductive end and has therefore evolved. So the ambition, political ambition, is equal to any other sort of ambition that men may have with regards to something that obtains resources, control, political influence. It all translates into reproductive opportunity. And people who commit these atrocious actions do so often with a political conviction, but not always. And they might have yearning for status, and then you're more looking at that the ideology is secondary to the status that they're looking for. That would be your classical evolutionary psychological analysis, is that this is first and foremost about status and influence more than the political ideology itself. So humans are, a political ape because it gave a reproductive edge in our past, and it still does give reproductive edge.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you that because I sometimes get the impression that some people are prone to political violence, not specifically because they are part of this or that political group, but because the kind of political narrative that the group they identify with uses serves as a sort of justification that they use to commit political violence, and not and I mean, it comes after the fact. It's not a direct motivation. It's more of a, as I said before, a post hoc rationalization for the fact that they want to, or they feel prone to committing politically violent acts anyway.
But prior to the violent act itself, obviously there will have to have been some kind of justification.
Yes, of course.
But yes, it's in human nature to want political power and influence and status. Violence is a way of achieving it. But the thing is that terrorism, for instance, is highly inefficient to get what you want, whether your ideology is strictly political or has some religious aspect to it. A given mass shooting, a given explosion, a given act of terrorism is very ineffective. But what it is effective towards is gaining notoriety. You will become a face and you will become a name thanks to mass media, both the traditional media but also social media. It is a way of obtaining notoriety, a celebdom that you otherwise wouldn't get. And what we see is that you will have political violence on both ends of a given political scale. Any religion, any of the big religions lends itself to being used as a reference for committing a violent act in the name of that religion. But the given person has perhaps gone through a rapid period of radicalization prior to the given act. And they're more likely to be suffering with regards to the mental health rather than having some kind of, coherent political membership. They won't necessarily have like some kind of well thought through political platform. That is more when you've got the coalitional political aggression. The lone actors, very seldom that you will find that they have some kind of political partisan membership that is coherent. It might be a one issue subject, for instance, but across the board, what you have is marginalized individuals who often experience social exclusion, mostly then from their physical environment, from their community, seeking then instead as a replacement, which is a poor replacement and a dangerous replacement on the internet, where there's then a quick, short period of radicalization. So it's more like marginalized social exclusion, mental health issues. But it is in human nature to aspire to status and to you, and in a male psychology more so than the female psychology, to use violent methods. That can be crime, that can be homicide, but it can also be political aggression. It's but it's in extreme situations, and you can get more like the old-fashioned. You and I are both of an age where we remember as terrorism being like terrorist groups who did have a coherent partisan membership with thought through political convictions, who would use the threat of violence to get something that they wanted, and then didn't commit the politic act if they got what they wanted. That's an old-fashioned idea of terrorism that we seem to have left behind in our current societies.
But I mean, in terms of perhaps demographics, we have to also, of course, there's the evolved psychology, but then there's also social and economic factors that can play a role here, right? You're talking about social isolation. There's perhaps some of these people perhaps are also unemployed. They don't have many job prospects or future prospects and stuff like that. So they are, in a way, many of them politically and socially disenfranchised.
Yes.
As well, right?
Yes, but with clear mental health issues. You see, when it comes to mass shootings that may or may not be associated with some sort of political ideology or religious ideology, and it can be quite spurious, as you were suggesting, what they decide, I'm doing this because, to justify. 80% of mass shooters in Europe in modern time have been suicidal.
Oh, yeah. Tell us more about that aspect of their suicidality, because at least at first sight, it might seem like a bit of an evolutionary puzzle. Why would someone who would be motivated to commit political violence for the reasons you explained before would also be suicidal? Because I mean, if they are suicidal and if they die by suicide, then they don't reap any benefits from it, right?
Well, there's a whole field on suicidality and evolutionary psychological analysis of that, which we don't have time to get into. That's an interview in itself. And it's a puzzle, yes, but we do have hypotheses attempting to answer it. Some suggesting that rather than trying to have an evolutionary psychological analysis of why we commit suicide and the adaptations that underpin committing suicide, you have those currently suggesting, Todd Shackelford, I believe a former guest of yours, suggesting that actually the adaptations is not committing suicide. But this is when I was suggesting earlier on in our interview that perhaps we should take a look at Hamilton's work. Now, Hamilton, you and your audience will be very familiar with his work on inclusive fitness and altruism.
Sure.
Why will the individual do something that damages itself to help others? Well, that's because those others we are most likely to help in such circumstances are people we share a genotype with. It's our family members. So we're more likely to do altruistic acts when it benefits someone who shares our genotype. Now, again, why do we then help other people, like donating blood, kidneys, running into burning buildings, etc.? Well, again, you have to then look at the fact that we used to live in groups of 150 individuals who mostly were related to us. But his work then on altruism, Hamilton himself, and I greatly recommend your audience to read this, he then used these principles to also look at spite. We are willing to damage ourselves as long as we're damaging other people a little bit more. That's spite. We will take a cost to ourselves as long as we know we're damaging someone else just a little bit more. Now, but still, anything with regards to whether it's homicide, suicide, altruism, spite, we have to remember when we're using evolutionary psychology, we are not sociobiologists. Sociobiologists. Sociobiologists would be looking at analysis on a behavioral level. This behavior, does this behavior make sense, evolutionary speaking? But in evolutionary psychology, we analyze things on a psychological level. Now, if psychologically men have a proneness towards wanting influence, wanting power, wanting status, wanting celebdom and notoriety, being known, being a name, you're willing to do quite a bit to do that. And now I apologize for the words I'm using now, but I'm trying to get a point across. But for someone who has no other avenues, getting famous, doing something that media is willing to cover, where you know guaranteed they're going to show your picture, they're going to give you a name, they're going to give you what you crave, and you have no other avenues for getting. You might try to attempt to kill as many people as possible before you kill yourself, or as it also happens sometimes, I said 80% are suicidal. That means some of them kill themselves before the police get to them. That means some of them kill themselves before the police even enter the scene. But some of them are also shot by the police, and it's a phenomenon that they call suicide by cop, that you do something so extreme that you know that the police will kill you, because perhaps Shackelford and his colleagues are correct in that it is in human nature to not hurt ourselves. It is difficult to kill other people, and it is difficult to kill yourself. And when you see these mass shooters, they often have considerably more weapons with them compared to the number of people they actually victimize, certainly lethally victimize, because they might be taken off guard at how hard it is for a human being to kill another human being, and how hard it actually is to harm ourselves, to actually kill ourselves. But it does speak to an absolute desperation. It does. It speaks to an absolute desperation.
Yeah, so look, we're focusing mostly on, or exclusively on, political violence, but since we're also including mass shooters here, do you think that what you just said would also apply to school shootings? Because there, the targets are mostly children, right, who are not political actors.
Well, we had a terrorist in Norway who chose children specifically. Now, he made the case of that they were the future of a certain political party he believed was damaging Norway. But the thing is also that children are an easy target. But you're also very, very guaranteed that media will cover the case if you do something so grotesque.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to the mental health of the person.
By
Because
the way,
I hope your audience doesn't misunderstand. I'm not saying that we are evolved to do these acts.
yes, of course.
We have what we have is an evolved psychology that means that when someone is utterly marginalized and is struggling with their mental health, we shouldn't be surprised that on occasion these things will happen. And we certainly shouldn't be surprised that these things happen when we do have a media that does reward these acts with celebdom. We are exposed to the picture sometimes sooner than they actually are confident in who the perpetrator is. Before we know anything about their mental health, names are given. And when the audience, when normal human beings are given this information, it can turn very ugly.
I was going to just comment another thing on that relates to Dr. Daly's work. But before that, since you touched on the media, I guess that you've already answered this question, at least indirectly, but should the media divulge personal information like the name about mass shooters and terrorists and their pictures and so on? Haven't criminologists and other kinds of related experts been warning for a very long time that this can produce copycat effects?
And you are rewarding them with precisely what they wanted and why they did it. You're giving them what they wanted. And we have just had a case in Norway where a young male, just turned 18, commits a homicide and is claiming that he's the one claiming this was a terrorist act, that he wanted to create fear in a certain segment of the population. And the media are, reiterating this. They're communicating what he wanted to do, and they're also showing his picture and his name. And there's been one newspaper that has gone a different route than what is normal procedure in media all over the world, and they have decided not to show his picture. I don't know if they've changed that in the past couple of days, because now there's a court case. But this young boy said to the media through his defense lawyer that he wanted to have his picture taken in court, because the early court procedures have started already. And he said through his defense attorney, I want my picture taken in court. That should be like the first sign for media to, maybe not. And they have discussed, should they not? And there are arguments for why, because it's a serious crime. Homicide is a serious crime. If this actually was a terrorist act as well, that's a serious crime. The public should know. It's media's responsibility to let the public know what's going on. But yes, as a criminologist, as a homicide researcher, as a violence researcher, I'm someone who has read the literature in all these decades, and I remember the 90s, and I remember the American experts being very firm on school mass shootings over there. They've had 300 mass shootings in the States so far this year. Even the same week as a very famous political assassination, which overshadowed the mass shooting with considerably more and younger victims.
Yeah.
One has to ask, when will they learn? And there's only one country that I see seems to be taking this lesson serious, and that's France. About 10 years ago, they finally, not all media in France. This is not something that all media in France agree on. It isn't like across the board decision.
Yeah.
And the different news media outlets, they go case by case, but some of them have taken a very principled stance in that we will pixelate pictures and we will withhold names. Withholding names is a little bit more problematic from a journalistic perspective, from a trust perspective, but pixelating pictures is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Just, you really shouldn't do that. And now I'm not a journalist, and so I can't make that sort of pros and cons, but from my point of view, who writes about and does interviews on what's the psychology underpinning these acts, celebdom, a want for fame to the extent of accepting that that's going to be notoriety, like a negative famous for doing something horrific. It's such a strong motivating factor for these infringed, socially isolated individuals who 80% of them in Europe are suicidal. So they are struggling with mental issues. Other of them are having psychotic symptoms. Like we're having a court case in these days in Norway of someone who was supposed to have done a terrorist act. But as it turns out, a couple of years later, he was so severely psychotic because he hadn't been treated for his psychiatric symptoms. And if he had been discovered prior to his terrorist act, his stepsister might be alive today.
Okay, so I was going to ask you another kind of question, but let me then touch already on a little bit more on the topic of mental illness, because I guess that this is a very sensitive topic, and I think it's important for people to get the correct information here. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the correct thing to say is that the vast majority of people who suffer from mental illness do not commit crime.
Oh, good.
But proportionally, there are more people who suffer from mental illness who commit crime than people from the general population. I mean, is this the correct information, or?
Crime is a large category of behavior. But if we just stick to mass shootings, 80% of them in Europe are suicidal. And I think that number is telling enough. So if we can do more to avoid infringement or the perception of being infringed, trust in the political system, community engagement, mental health, being taken care of, discovered at an early age, and help being offered to more young men, and also not showing them on a daily basis that a quick way to celebdom, to fame, is to kill other people.
Yeah. So let me ask you now, because we've been focusing a lot on males. How about females?
Females? Yes.
Are there also are there also female terrorists? Are there also females who commit acts of political violence or not?
You know, in modern history, 60% of rebel groups have had female members. So yes, the typical male warrior in historic times was males. There's no question about that. Sometimes you'll get some, the odd, and I mean that in every way, the odd article saying that females were warriors, females did big game hunting. Generally, no. Generally, females don't have the upper body strength of males do on a group level. So small game hunting, yes, but on occasion you will have formidable women who didn't get pregnant and who could join in warfare, tribal or larger, and join in on wild game hunting. But they were so few and far between that they haven't shaped. They didn't become grandmothers like those other females who took care of themselves throughout pregnancy and nursing. But in
I mean, like the Viking shield maidens. I mean, I'm making this. I'm making this joke because you're from Norway. So.
I've got Edvard Munch on my wall there. But yeah, few and far between. They existed, but not to the extent of that they have shaped the psychology of women today or the physique of women today. Although you will on occasion have formidable women. Absolutely. But in modern days, when women can control things to a greater extent than we could historically speaking, 60% of groups that are termed, defined, operationalized as rebel groups, 60% have female members. Now, what those female members are doing, one has to study that research more closely, but they actually have female members at all. And you've got numbers from Europol showing that a fifth of terrorist plots in Europe in modern times, current day Europe, a fifth of them have females associated to plotting those terrorist acts in Europe, according to Europol. So females do perpetrate, engage, enable, assist terrorist acts and political violence. That's a thing. And Europol and the United Nations are continuously, on an irregular basis, warning about this and trying to draw attention to it. But no, not to the same extent as men. And that's the third hypothesis that I promised in the beginning of our interview, which was proposed by Anne Campbell, the late Anne Campbell, the incredible Anne Campbell, in a paper from 1999, which I know I have jazzed about in interviews with you previously, published in 1999, called Staying Alive, and that's her hypothesis. Again, just like Robert Trivers showed us we had to do, refer back to the reproductive role of the sexes if you're trying to identify the evolutionary origin and function and possible adaptive role of a given trait. And she said that women have evolved due to 9 months of gestation, up to 4 years of nursing children in our species, in our evolutionary past, in hunter-gatherer societies. We had to stay alive. So we are selected, females are selected towards hesitating against committing violent acts. However, throughout her article, she warns against ignoring the fact that women are capable of and do perpetrate violent acts. She warns against just pathologizing women for doing it. And you can use her work to also approach female political violence, be it mass shootings, be it terrorism, be it political assassinations. Women can also do this. And I haven't studied myself, but if there are any budding researchers out there on female political violence, my suggestion would be that we know that women are often on the left side of the political scale, so you're more likely to find the political terrorists there. Also, we know that females are more prone to stronger religiosity than males. You might find them there as well. You also know that on the left side of the scale, the political violence will damage property, whereas right-wing political violence targets human beings, people. Left-wing political violence targets buildings. And so, all in all, there's great reason to believe that females might engage. There is one terrorist organization, ISIS, who has taken this more serious than any politician or group of researchers with regards to recruiting females. And that's the ISIS. In their caliphate, they were targeting, with specific propaganda, targeting females to join their caliphate and their movement. So they were targeting females on purpose. And so politicians and people who want to prevent this, and researchers who want to study it, they should have a look at the forgotten female gaze in all of this, because females too want political influence, want status, and can also decide to cause damage, aggress in that regards. And the most well-known terrorist organization in the 1900s was the suffragettes movement.
Yeah.
They were deemed, they were termed, they were considered, they were categorized to be terrorists, and they would damage themselves for the cause of getting the right to vote. So what Campbell says in her paper, which I absolutely demand that your audience reads, is she said that if you appreciate the female gaze, you can identify at what point does the scales tip for a female, where a female is willing to perpetrate violence after all. Because we are not evolved to just be passive and meek. We're not.
Yeah. Okay, so I have one final question for you, which is more of a general commentary. Since you're a criminologist, this is something that we've already touched a little bit, I think, in our previous conversation. But I would bet, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I would bet that this sort of thing bothers you. Whenever such an act like this, terrorist act, mass shooting, an assassination, some act of political violence occurs, or even a school shooting, sometimes even before we know anything at all about the perpetrators, people start immediately speculating, and they bring out their pitchforks, and they are already saying who is responsible for this act. It's this side or that side, or they say that it. Sometimes we hear that from some people that it has nothing at all to do with mental illness or with social and economic issues. That doesn't matter at all. Doesn't it bother you that, how should I put it? I was going to say that society or the media allows for this kind of speculation to run amok, but as a criminologist, doesn't it bother you that people have this impulse or this tendency to get to conclusions when the criminal process itself, what police have to go through, what investigators have to go through, and then the trial and the evidence that people have to evaluate and so on and so forth is usually so complex, but people just don't care or don't seem to care at all about that complexity.
And what you're describing is this tribal, coalitional psychology of in-out groups. There's a paper I read recently, which I really enjoyed. I'm not very good at pronouncing names from other languages than the Anglo and Norwegian. Moncrief is how I'd pronounce it with my British accent, published a paper in 2024. And he suggested that the reason why terrorism is so hard to define is because scholars have a different approach than lay people have.
Yeah.
And he looked at research, seeing how lay people, what will make lay people more or less likely to categorize an act as terrorism. And one of the things that the research shows is that if it's performed by an out-group member, we're more likely to say it was a terrorist act than if it was one of our own. And his overall point in his paper, or at least maybe it wasn't, but it certainly is the one I remember. The message I took from it was that because lay people have ideas of what terrorism is, that suggests that both perpetration and risk assessment has been selected for, and we have therefore been under selection pressure to not only the perpetration of political violence, but also to do a risk assessment. So what you're describing is people trying to do a risk assessment, trying to figure out whether it was one of their own or not, was this a terrorist act or not, to protect themselves, to try to figure out what has happened. But humans are not very good at this. And that's why we have created professionals to do this for us. And I was doing an interview after a mass shooting that happened in Sweden in February, and I was doing a interview on a live debate show here in Norway. And the first question I got from the anchor, brilliant anchor, he asks me, how can we understand the psychology of someone who commits a mass shooting and then kills themselves? And my first answer, unprepared, but it's an answer to your question, is if you want an answer, go to research, don't go to social media. Social media is dangerous on so many levels. It's dangerous with regards to encouraging such acts. It's dangerous with regards to the aftermath of such acts. So social media is a terrifying place, and whereas I would have hoped for, and I do encourage traditional media outlets to stay sober, I think lately we're seeing less and less sobriety from them. But yeah, I think that has to be my long-winded, as always, answers. As you know, my answers are never short. I always give answers that last like 15 minutes, and I apologize that I've got very long-winded answers this time as well on your show. But thank you so much for having me, and I hope to see you again a fifth time.
No, of course. And by the way, just before I end the recording, just to let the audience know, if they're not aware, that because I mentioned Dr. Daly's interview, I also have an interview with Dr. Robert Rivers on the show from 2019. So some of the things referenced here, you can go there and listen from the man himself.
From the man himself, the legend.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ottesen, it's always a a massive pleasure to have you on the show. And as you said, I'm also looking forward to a fifth interview somewhere in the future, because it's always fascinating to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ignik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.